The starting point for this talk was the discovery of a cache of objects at the bottom of a cupboard in the house of an aunt, which I was clearing out after her death. These objects all related to my great-uncle, William Sutton Gardner, who was killed during the First World War. He was a second lieutenant serving in the Royal Flying Corps as an observer, and he died when he was 19. I'd always known this. Indeed, I'd had his service medals since I was a boy, but this cache of objects included photographs of his grave at several stages, in fact, both when it was just on its own in the graveyard and later a view showing it surrounded by still more graves, items from the school magazine, a report of the erection of a tablet in his memorial. Extraordinarily, even the buttons of his uniform, his epaulettes, just about everything that his bereaved mother could get of his she had kept. Obviously, as for all the families that lost someone in that war or any war, this was a hugely traumatic event. Indeed, its ripples carried onward into the next generation, because when news came to the house of his death, my grandmother, his sister, was in the middle of writing a letter to him, and as a result of this, she never wrote a letter to my father when he was on active service during the Second World War, because she felt that a similar terrible thing might happen, something which caused, as one can imagine, considerable tension between them. However, it's not the dimension of grief that I want to explore this evening. It's the fact of the cross, used as a symbol of the death of this young man in war. The cross, obviously derived from the Christian cross, the cross of Jesus, who went as a lamb to the slaughter, turning the other cheek, dying a sacrificial death, not calling upon the legions of angels he might have called upon, but suffering and dying. The use of the cross and of other Christian symbols in the context of that war led many to reflect on what one might call the theological dimension of war. To put it at its simplest, if God was so good, if God was all-powerful, how could he let anything like this happen? Of course, at the beginning, everybody was convinced of the nobility and the justness of their cause, but as the war went on, as the losses mounted, as the realization that actually the guys on the other side were pretty much the same as us, except that they were on the other side, and it became clearer and clearer to many that this was just an awful tragedy in which the supposedly Christian countries of Russia, Germany, Great Britain and others were tearing themselves apart, bleeding themselves to death. How could this have happened? What was God doing about it? He didn't seem to be doing very much. And certainly not just for war poets, famously Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen and others, but for a number of theologians. This led them to profoundly rethink their ideas of God, and the talk is about three of them. A German, Paul Tillich, who became one of the most influential theologians in the English-speaking world after he had had to emigrate in 1933 when Hitler came to power, very influential on the British theology of the 1950s and 60s. A French Jesuit, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and the English theologian Geoffrey Studdert Kennedy, better known as Woodbine Willie from his habit of giving out a particularly noxious band of cigarette to the troops. So, British, French, German, a Lutheran, a Catholic, an Anglican. Two of them, Paul Tillich and Studdert Kennedy, served as frontline padres. Teilhard de Chardin served as a stretcher-bearer in the Battle of Verdun, perhaps the most catastrophic of all the battles of the Western Front during the First World War. All of them, as I said, led to radically reconsider the idea of God's providence. They could not see the war simply as the unfolding of some great plan that God had long prepared in advance. If that was what God was like, then they wanted nothing to do with it. Studart Kennedy, as well as writing several theological books, also wrote quite a lot of poems in a very popular idiom in which he expressed his outrage at such a God, very, very forcefully, indeed scandalizing quite a number of people who read them. Tillich, too, was led to reconsider the idea of providence, and for him this was no longer the unfolding of a plan, but nevertheless, even in the midst of the catastrophe, even in the midst of the terror, he believed there were still possibilities for the human beings involved to find and to reaffirm their faith in the power of love. Teilhard de Chardin offers a very interesting perspective. As well as being a Jesuit, priested in 1918, he was also a paleontologist studying human origins, and he was one of the first modern theologians both to fully embrace the doctrine of evolution and to try to synthesize it with his own Christian view of the world. And he saw the war as part of the planetary evolutionary development of human beings. As such, of course, it was terrible, but he also saw it breaking down barriers between nations, between communities, a step on the way towards what we call now globalization. He saw happening in his own time, he lived through much of the 20th century, what he called a planetization of human consciousness, in which human beings were breaking out of their old nationalisms, their own divisions, and creating one new planetary mind, a further step in what he called the Christification of the universe, that for him Christ was not someone who lived in the past. Christ was also the omega point, the point to which, through all the blood and toil and tears, the human community was gradually, painfully evolving. So these are the three thinkers that I want to consider in the talk, to look at some of their ideas and then to invite questions and thoughts on how they might still be relevant for us today.